오늘의 영어 뉴스. The Royal Roots of Quebec's French. Quebecois French has long been mocked for its rough and tumble sound, but this version of French is more likely what 17th century French aristocracy spoke, including the king. It was a perfect sun-splashed summer afternoon as my mother and I mingled through Quebec City's old town, stopping at Place Royale, a 400-year-old cobblestone square of historical grey stone buildings with dormer windows and pitched roofs in red, copper, and slate. My mother was born and raised in this French-speaking city, so I knew that now, at 80, it meant a lot to her to be back for a visit. As we reminisced, the sound of the local accent floated around us, and I thought about something I'd recently heard, that while the French spoken in Quebec may not ring as romantic and mellifluous to the ear as contemporary Parisian French, now considered the gold standard, the way the Quebecois speak is actually closer in pronunciation to the French used by 17th century aristocrats and even the king. I grew up in Montreal in the 1960s and 70s when Anglophones, along with the French from France, mocked the rough and tumble pronunciation of Quebec French, comparing it to the quacking of dogs. I myself was always deeply embraced in the company of my Anglophone classmates at French immersion school, so-called pundits, and my teachers who hailed from France and Morocco said that the relaxed Quebec pronunciation was disgraceful, that it made a mockery of the language of Molière. As it turns out, the celebrated 17th century playwright likely sounded more like a modern-day Quebecois rather than a temporary Parisian than they knew. I'd actually balked when someone told me this a few weeks earlier over lunch at a cafe in North Hatley, a quaint village in the gently mountainous eastern townships southeast of Montreal. I'd known that Quebecois French had retained many vestiges of Le Francaise Droit, or the King's French, especially in its vocabulary, but I drew the line at pronunciation. There's no way that Louis XV said "pour voila" or "to et more." I'd said incredulously as I compared those to the more commonly accepted pronunciations of pass, boiler, and toy and more. But there are logical, linguistic, and historical reasons why Quebecois French is different from French, what linguists call normative or neutralized French. There is one thing that characterizes Quebecois French, and that is its rhythm, said Chantal Bouchard, a social linguist in the French department at Montreal's McGill University and author of Méchante langue, la légitimate linguistique du franchise parlé à Québec, wicked language, the linguistic legitimacy of the French spoken in Quebec. We in Quebec have conserved something from 17th century French, the distinction between the long vowels and the short vowels. She gave the example of the I, vowel. If one says a voice fights, you do make. The Quebecois vowel is short, as in get. But if one says la fête, the party, the vowel is long, as in hey. The French have not considered this short-long vowel difference. She explained, they still spell fights and fête differently, but they pronounce them both the same way. Claude Poirier, a historian of Quebec French at the Université Laval in Quebec City, has spent a lot of time poring over 17th century archival documents to determine if the spelling of certain words could give us an idea of their pronunciation. He found that in the 1658 Court Acts, a lawyer who came to Quebec from Poitou in west central France spelled perdire lose as padre, which is closer to how some people in Quebec still pronounce the word. Another example he found was the word devour, must or to be obliged to. It was spelled devour, he said, and was pronounced devour, the way many elderly Quebecois still pronounce it today. Another major difference is vocabulary. Words like char for car, piaze, slang for dollar, dispendieux for expensive, patate for potato, and barre for locked, instead of the normative French ferme à clef, closed with a key. All originate from a more antiquated French, no longer used in France. So how is that Quebec's version retained more 17th century aristocratic relics than was spoken in Paris, the accepted seat of the French language? Both Bouchard and Poirier noted that 16th and 17th century French settlers who immigrated to Quebec, then known as New France, tended to be natives of northern and western France. Aside from royalty and the aristocracy, only one-third of the people in France spoke French at that time. The rest spoke their original languages, such as Breton, Provençal, or Norman. In New France, however, concerted efforts were made to teach the new arrivals French, and it was the version spoken at the royal court by the aristocracy of the north and the west. Thus, aristocratic French became generalized among the settlers. In the mid-1700s, French explorer Louis-Antoine de Bougainville even wrote that the Canadian accent is as pure as that of the Parisians. But everything began to change in 1759, when France lost its calling to the British at the Battle of the Prince of Abraham in Quebec City. Contact between France and New France was ruptured, and with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the good part of the elite returned to Europe. More dramatic changes came with the French Revolution, cutting off the mother country from its former calling for another 4 decades. According to Poirier, during this period of alienation, scholars in France embarked on a massive effort to spread the use of French and standardizing its grammar and pronunciation. The bourgeoisie dumped all the pronunciations they didn't deem perfect, and they continued their purification through the 18th century, he said. In short, French in France changed, while in Quebec it stayed more or less the same. The Quebecois are conservatives, said Poirier. They conserved the French language as it was spoken in the ancient region. By the time the French began traveling to Quebec again, then known as Lower Canada, around 1830, the difference had become extreme. When famous French thinker Alexis de Tocqueville visited in 1831, he wrote in a letter to his mother, "Canada raises our curiosity. The French nation has been preserved there. As a result, one can observe the customs and the language spoken during Louis XIV's reign." And in another letter, he admitted, "It seems more like old France lives. Old France lives on in Canada, and that it is our country, France, which is the new one." Though some YouTubers still make fun of the Quebec accent, perceptions have changed a lot over the past 10 to 20 years, as a huge influx of French expats has arrived, particularly to Montreal and Quebec City. Marielle Lumineau and her sister Irene Lumineau relocated from France to Quebec 20 and 16 years ago, respectively, and fell hard for Laval province, so much so that they wrote Iste, les Francaise au Québec, a humorous, light-hearted guide for other expats. The duo have picked up some of the telltale Quebec accent and inflections, and their kids, who range from 7 to 16, are completely Quebecois, said Marie. Younger generations in France, Belgium, and Francophone Switzerland have also embraced the accent. What's more, Quebec films have garnered the prestigious César Award at Cannes, and Quebec comedians like Sugar Sammy are in huge demand on French stages. The French language and the sense of pride in the Quebecois identity have indeed come a long way. The French language is central to the Quebec identity, said Bouchard. We've made a lot of progress since the 1960s with regard to the presence of French in the public space. French as the common language, the right to work in French, the number of people here who are fluent in French, but things remain very fragile. Indeed, many here still remain self-conscious about the way they speak. But Dominique Couinard, the former French teacher in Montreal, and now a curriculum consultant to other French teachers, wants this attitude to end. French is full of idiosyncrasies. Every country in the French-speaking world has its own peculiarities. She said some immigrants who came here from France and French-speaking countries like Morocco, who insist that their kids not speak Quebecois French, are just being snobs. We have to stop beating ourselves up about it. We need to stop thinking we don't speak proper French.